Welcome to our 9th class on the book of Ecclesiastes during lockdown in the United Kingdom. This class was taught on Tuesday, 26th May 2020 for the British Bible School in a Zoom class setting. The outline we are using for this particular study is looking at Ecclesiastes in 4 sections. We are currently in the 3rd section, and we're going to be in chapter 9 this evening. But before we get to chapter 9, let's do a quick review of the first 8 chapters. The theme we find in this book, this is what it says in chapter 1. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. And we're seeing that phrase as we go throughout the book as well. But Solomon is searching for a meaning in life. And in chapters 2 through 6, we saw this through a series of case studies. He examined pleasure and human achievement, doing things at the right time or the right time for doing things, the need for justice, success, wealth, loneliness, and misery, and all that loneliness and misery brought. And we saw all of that. And each time the conclusion has been, this is meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. And it very much is meaningless as Solomon views life. In chapter 7, Solomon began an inquiry into the difference between wisdom and foolishness. He wanted to know which is better. In chapter 7, we saw that there were some advantages to wisdom, but we also saw that it's not in humans to discover it. So even though there are some advantages, we can't go out and buy it off the shelf. It's not in us to discover it. Then in chapter 8, he continued this examination, and his conclusion there was that wisdom can't answer all the questions in life. That's not what wisdom was set out to do. Derek Kidner, before getting into chapter 9 in his commentary, had this to say. He says, before the positive emphasis of the final 3 chapters can emerge, we have to make sure that we shall be building on nothing short of hard reality. In case we should be cherishing some comforting illusions, chapter 9 confronts us with the little that we know, and then with the vast extent of what we cannot handle, and in particular with death, the ups and downs of fortune, and the erratic favors of the crowd. So there's a quick preview as to what we're going to be seeing here in chapter 9. The section we're in, a contrast of wisdom and foolishness, we're in the 3rd section of that. So titled this section, that we need to live a prepared life. And we're going to look at it in 3 sections in this lesson. First section is that all will die and are quickly forgotten. And then we'll look at, because of that, we need to do all we can while we live. Do all you can while you live. And then the last section, he does look at some of the advantages of wisdom. So, as we look at chapter 9, the idea is the need to live a prepared life. Of course, this is still based on observations of life and wisdom. So let's get into the first 6 verses. All die and are quickly forgotten. So I reflected on all this and concluded that the righteous, the wise, and what they do are in God's hands. But no one knows whether love or hate awaits them. All share a common destiny, the righteous and the wicked, the good and the bad, the clean and the unclean, those who offer sacrifices and those who do not. As it is with the good, so with the sinful. As it is with those who take oaths, so with those who are afraid to take them. This is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes all. The hearts of people, moreover, are full of evil, and there is madness in their hearts while they live, and afterwards they join the dead. Anyone who is among the living has hope. Even a live dog is better off than a dead lion. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward. Even their name is forgotten. Their love, their hate, their jealousy have long since vanished. Never again will they have a part in anything that happens under the sun. I chose this photograph here to go with this section, especially because of what he said the last section there. The dead know nothing, even their names forgotten. I took this photograph at the Cold Harbor battlefield in the state of Virginia a few years ago when I was visiting that Civil War battlefield. But we don't know who this is. What he did is unknown. It's forgotten. All we have is a number of what grave it was in that particular cemetery, grave 760. And we don't know who he was. He's forgotten. What he did in the war, totally forgotten. But Solomon's reflecting on life here. He's examining it, and he's trying his best to arrive at a conclusion. So he decides that all people, righteous and the wise, are in the hand of God, as well as what they do being in God's hand. Now, it seemed that the hand here in the original text in Hebrew is a singular word. It's either in God's hand. NIV put God's hands. I think that's the way we would normally say it in English, but apparently it's more literally, it's in God. We are in God's hand. Derek Kidner, again, wrote in his commentary, "We have only to use our eyes without prejudice, according to Psalm 19 and Romans 1:19 and verses following, to see that there's a powerful and glorious Creator. But it takes more than observation to discover how he's disposed towards us." And I think that's where Solomon is going. Yes, we can look around creation. We can see there's a Creator. But just seeing that the Creator exists doesn't tell us about him, doesn't tell us what he thinks about what we are doing. Solomon tells us that everybody is in God's hand. And also, because of that, no one knows what awaits them. That can have a couple of different aspects to it. Some commentators, there's a question amongst commentators as to what this is talking about. But he talks about no one knows how others possibly going to react or what's in their future. That would make some sense. Whether the person is going to be loved or hated. And that could be talking about whether they're going to receive good or bad from those around them. That may be the idea there. Or it could even be the idea of whether they will be accepted or rejected by God. Whether we're going to receive good or bad from God, and those love and hate being used in those terms. Could be either one of those. Could be God's attitude towards us. One commentator I was reading suggested because this follows chapter 8, verse 17, and there were, of course, no chapter divisions, and the emphasis back in end of chapter 8 was on God, that he thought it made the most sense that this is speaking about God and his reaction to us. But I wouldn't discount either that we don't know how people are going to react to us either. Keep in mind that all of this is coming from Solomon's perspective. He does say, and again, this is from his perspective, that ultimately all will share the same destiny, the same fate. Whether they're righteous or wicked, whether they're good or bad, whether they're clean or unclean, those who sacrifice, those who don't, whether a good person or a sinner, whether the person makes vows or takes oaths or are afraid to do that. The unfortunate fact is that we all share the same destiny. By the way, he's taking his time getting around to telling us what he's talking about, what this destiny is. Derek Kidner wrote that to all appearances, God is just not interested. The things that are supposed to matter most to him turn out to make no difference, or none that anyone can see, to the way we're disposed of in the end. Moral or immoral, religious or profane, we're all mown down alike. In 100 years, as we say, it will all come to the same thing. Now notice all of this, and I keep emphasizing this, all of this is Solomon's viewpoint. At this stage, it is solely a worldly and physical viewpoint. He's simply observing life as he sees it, and he's not stating definitively that this is the way that God looks at us. This is just his observation from looking at life. We all share the same destiny, he said, no matter who you are. Then he finally gets around to saying it. We're all going to die. And it would seem from a worldly perspective that it really doesn't matter if we're following God or not. We're still going to die. Whether we follow God or not, death faces us all. In addition to all of that, the hearts of all people, he says, are full of evil, and there is foolishness in their hearts. And then, of course, they die. And this is what he refers to as the common fate of us all, death. Death is what we all have to look forward to. Derek Kidner again says, to live in an apparently meaningless world is deeply disillusioning. And disillusion breeds destructiveness or despair, the madness of the violent or of the hopelessly withdrawn. Yeah, this viewpoint of life is very disillusioning, and it can bring about despair, making somebody either violent or even hopelessly withdrawn. Goes on to talk about, Heim outlines it this way, that there are 3 advantages, though, that the living have over the dead. Now, I am sure that we could think of a whole lot more than 3. But here's the ones that Solomon mentions. The first of these is, as long as a person is alive, there is hope. I think we would agree with that. As long as there is life, there's hope. And that's why we choose to go on living a lot of times. We have hope, and we have hope that things will get better. Second advantage, this is in the form of a proverb. A live dog is better than a dead lion. Now we might think, well, yeah, of course. Absolutely. Something alive is always better than something dead. But we've got to realize the way that dogs and lions were viewed back in Solomon's day. Lions were regarded as the great beasts that they are, the king of the beasts, we call them. Dogs, though, weren't cuddly pets. Dogs were viewed as scavengers, filthy. But what he's saying is that as long as something is alive, it is better than something dead. So that idea is still coming through here. He's reinforcing the idea that as long as a person is alive, there is hope. The third advantage that Solomon sees is this. The living know that they will eventually die, but the dead know nothing, at least from our perspective. They know nothing because they are not here. Now, this could refer to several things, and again, if you read the commentaries, you'll discover these things in them. Some suggest that he may just be talking about consciousness, being aware of what's going on. Or some even make it a little bit more specific, and some would suggest he's talking about consciousness of impending death. The dead have no consciousness that it's going to happen, whereas those of us who are alive do. What this is not stating is that once we're dead, we know nothing. He's talking specifically about the dead no longer knowing what is happening under the sun, what is happening on the earth. They're not conscious about what's going on down here. Derek Kidner had a good comment on this. He said, out of context, the dead know nothing has sometimes been treated as a straight doctrinal statement. But even apart from the author's method, both this statement and the next one being they have no more reward, would clash with other scriptures if it's taken as a straight doctrinal statement. Thing is, if we know we're going to eventually die, isn't that not a reason to do something good with whatever time we have left? And perhaps that is what Solomon is hinting at. He goes on to talk about 5 circumstances that show the pitiable state of the dead, as New Time puts it again. And therefore, of course, it promotes the benefits of being alive. He's definitely coming down on the side that being alive is better than being dead. He says the thing is, the dead lack consciousness. We just looked at that. Secondly, he says, the dead have no further reward here on the earth. Keeping in mind that he's talking here about an earthly perspective, not speaking about eternity. As far as this life goes, there's nothing more for them to gain from this life. And then, of course, people will eventually forget them. And, we do forget most people, don't we? How many of us can think back 100 years, 200 years, and our own family lineage, and be able to tell people about the people that lived back then? We've forgotten them. We don't know who they are. Sometimes we forget them a lot sooner than that. But people will eventually forget them. Fourthly, he says, they no longer have any emotions. What they loved, what they hated, what they envied, what they were jealous of, that perished long ago. They no longer have those emotions. And the fifth thing he mentions is they no longer play a part in anything that happens on the earth. They no longer have any influence. That's the state of the dead. There's definitely a benefit to being alive, isn't there? And that's where Solomon's going. And even though we don't have that in the text, we could almost have a therefore here, but we don't. I'm sure if the Apostle Paul was writing this, he would put a therefore in. But he's going to talk about because we are alive, we need to do all we can while we live. Picking up at verse 7. Go, eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Always be clothed in white, always anoint your head with oil. Enjoy life with your wife whom you love all the days of this meaningless life that God has given you under the sun. All your meaningless days. For this is your lot in life, and in your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for in the realm of the dead where you're going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. I've seen something else under the sun. The race is not to the swift, or the battle to the strong. Nor does food come to the wise, or wealth to the brilliant, or favor to the learned. But time and chance happen to them all. Moreover, no one knows when their hour will come. As fish are caught in a cruel net, or birds are taken in a snare, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. So, what are we to do? Is basically what Solomon's asking. Because we're still alive, we're not yet in the place of the dead, what are we to do? Well, he replies, we should eat our food with joy. We should drink our wine with a happy heart, because God has approved what we're doing. He's telling us, as he's told us before in this book, he's telling us we need to enjoy our lives, because these are the lives that God has given us. Knut Heim says, this is a commendation of a life well lived, embracing the simple but good things in life, such as food and drink, as gifts from a generous God. He entitled this section of his commentary as a carpe diem passage. If you're familiar with that phrase, carpe diem, means seize the day. He says this is a seize the day passage We need to go and we need to eat our food with joy. We need to drink our wine with a happy heart. Of course, he doesn't stop there. He goes on ahead. He says, let your clothes always be white. Now, that could mean a number of things. In a hot climate, it is more comfortable to wear white, so maybe that's what he's talking about. Wear comfortable clothing, eat your food with joy, drink your wine with happy heart, wear comfortable clothing. That could be it. Many commentators take this to be a garment that's only worn on special occasions. So maybe he's saying here that we should make every occasion a special one. Let your clothes always be white. Another commentator suggested that this refers to having a pure life, taking a more spiritual aspect to it. And that could be the idea here. And if so, always live the good life for God. Whichever, your clothes being white has to do with having a good life. And he goes on to say, may oil never be lacking on your head. This is what those who are healthy and well did every day. They put oil on their head. Some countries, they still do. It was a sign of being healthy. So again, he's wishing upon them eating your food with joy, drinking wine with a happy heart, having white, the best, the nice clothing, and being in good health. Again, Knut Heim says that these are more than the bare necessities of life, but they're not items of conspicuous luxury either. They are the ordinary good things of life, relatively modest pleasures such as festive clothing and oil used for skin care, items that were relatively easily available. So that's what we need to be doing, Solomon says. And goes on to say, enjoy life with your beloved wife all the days of your meaningless life. And I'm not sure, by the way, we should put that on a Valentine's Day card. Yes, enjoy life with your beloved wife, with the wife you love, but you best not suggest that your life with your wife is meaningless. But notice what Solomon is saying there. All the days of your meaningless life that God has given to you during your meaningless days. Keep in mind that as well, this is coming from Solomon, who had 300 wives and 700 concubines, which are in essence servant wives, 1,000 of them. But he says, enjoy life with the wife you love. Maybe he learned that it's better off just having the one, even though he had so many. But he says that this is our reward for all the toilsome labor that we do. In other words, if we want an enjoyable life, then we need a lifelong commitment to our spouse. By the way, this phrase, your meaningless life, that comes up twice here, it's repeated. Some translations don't have it twice. They only have it once. They think that it's the result of what's called a tautography, that something was repeated but shouldn't have been. He saw something very similar and repeated it again. But others suggest that those who don't have it, the manuscripts which don't have it, may be a result of what's called haplography. That as they were writing it, they saw it again and didn't write it thinking they were seeing it what they saw the first time. So that's just a little bit technical stuff there. But tautography, haplography, that comes out in manuscripts a lot. But we have here the emphasis that Solomon's view, this is a meaningless life. Don't worry, chapters 11 and 12 are still coming. And he goes on to say that whatever you find to do, do it with all your might. Of course, in the text there it says, do it with all your might, because you're not going to be able to do that in the realm of the dead. There's no planning, there's no working, there's nothing to be done there. So possibly what he's saying here is do the best we can at all times while we're alive. Do it while we have the strength, while we have the health to do it. Denny Petrillo wrote in 9 verses 7 through 10, He suggested that people choose to experience happiness in 5 categories: food and drink, clothes, medicine, marriage, and labor. The believer who turns his life over to God first can then have a fulfilled life. He need not worry about acceptance. He knows he's accepted by God and can eat with a cheerful heart. So Diddy there in his commentary is making an application, isn't he, for us as Christians, that these are areas that we can find happiness in. But in order to find happiness in these areas, we need to have turned our lives over to God. Derek Kidner said, for his counsels recommending an acceptance and enjoyment of the possible in every case contain a pointer to God. Indeed, a positive will of God. He's quoting there a chap named Von Rad. But if that's true, all these things are pointing towards God. Keep in mind, the reason we should do all of this is because there's no work, there's no planning, there's no knowledge, there's no wisdom in the grave, the place that we're all eventually going to go. If we're going to do anything in these areas, we need to do them now, because we're not going to have an opportunity to do them in the future. He further observed that life doesn't always turn out the way we expect. And those of us, of course, we're in this coronavirus as we have these classes. And isn't that true? Life hasn't turned out the way we planned it for the year 2020, hasn't it? Has it? I remember starting this year with a lesson on having 2020 vision, on imitating Jesus, on doing those things that Jesus did. And suddenly, and though we can still do some things Jesus did, we've got to do it pretty well secluded because we're locked up. In the British Bible School, we had plans for study weekends. We had planned 3 weekends, or 5 weekends of 3 different modules to look at. And as it turned out, we were only able to do 2 weekends. And that was it. Instead, we've been doing different lessons totally. Maybe the lesson for us to learn is that it doesn't turn out the way we plan, but we need to be willing to adapt our plans to what the situation is that we find ourselves. But that's straying away from what Solomon's saying. What Solomon's saying is that he's observed that life doesn't turn out the way we plan. He says the race isn't always won by the swiftest. And we realize that sometimes someone who's not quite as swift will be able to win the race. Maybe he timed himself better than the swiftest person did. He says the battle isn't necessarily won by the strongest, was not necessarily won by the largest army. How many times in history have battles been won by smaller armies, but who did things in a better way? Prosperity or food doesn't always belong to the wisest people. Food is what the NIV has. Prosperity, other translations, doesn't always belong to the wisest. And wealth doesn't always belong to the most discerning. So perhaps food should be in that section there. And success and favor doesn't always come to the one who's the most knowledgeable. That's not the way life is. Just because you may have certain attributes doesn't mean it's always going to go your way. And the problem is, and Solomon points it out here, time and chance play their part too. And time and chance may overcome all of these things so that it doesn't work out the way we had planned. Derek Kidner wrote that time and chance are paired, no doubt, because they both have a way of taking matters suddenly out of our hands. This is obvious enough where chance is concerned. With regard to time, chapter 3 has already shown how relentlessly our lives are swung from one extreme to another by the tidal pull of forces we do not control. And I thought that was a good comment. Time may take this out of our hands because a person may not have enough time, or the time might not be right for what he's trying to do. Chance. Yeah, accidents happen which change our plans. As the NIV puts it, so people are trapped by evil times that fall unexpectedly upon them. And very, very true. And maybe that's very applicable to our situation in the coronavirus. Net Bible there had, all people are ensnared at an unfortunate time that falls upon them suddenly. They can ensnare us as well. The thing is, no one knows their appointed time. And I'm presuming he's speaking here still about the topic of death, that no one knows the time that they're appointed to leave the world. He uses two little illustrations. It says, like fish which are swimming and suddenly get caught up in a net. You can picture the fish, can't you, swimming in the Sea of Galilee or wherever he might happen to be, and suddenly he's caught up in a net and he's pulled into shore, and becomes somebody's dinner. Yeah, he was just minding his own business. Or what about a bird minding their own business? And suddenly it steps into a snare. And Solomon's application here is people get ensnared at the most unfortunate of times, and their lives suddenly end. No one knows when it's going to happen. If we did know when it was going to happen, we'd be ready for it, wouldn't we? Or so we think. G.S. Hendry, in the New Bible Commentary, said this: life is a course in which all must run together. All must take the same hurdles and the same hazards, and all come to the same end. Nevertheless, there is a judgment. There are some who are in God's hand, whose works are accepted of him, and who may devote themselves with a single heart to the task of the moment without anxious thought for the morrow. So long as the race is running, there is hope for all, even for those who appear most hopeless. The knowledge that they must die may make the living wise, but for those who have passed the limits of hope, hope is gone. For them the day of grace is past, and the door is shut. I think he makes a good application of all this to our lives today. As long as we're in the race, as long as we're living, we've got hope. Once we're past those limits, once we are no longer alive, all hope is gone, because then we cannot change our lives. Solomon finishes this section by looking at some of the advantages of wisdom. Let's pick up with verse 13. I saw under the sun this example of wisdom that greatly impressed me. There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built huge siege works against it. Now, there lived in that city a man, poor but wise. He saved the city by his wisdom. But nobody remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength. But the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are no longer heeded. The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Knutheim has this as his 10th case study. We've not seen a case study since chapter 6, but he identifies this as the 10th one, and he's probably right. He calls this wisdom without wealth is ignored. And I think he's got that right, because the poor man here, he saves the city by his wisdom, and then he's ignored after that. His words are despised. So he talks here about the advantage that wisdom gives. So he has a city that's besieged. It's got a few men in it, and there's a great king comes against it, builds the great siege works. And this could refer to a real incident, or it could just be a story that he's telling, a hypothetical one. We don't know. But in the town, there's a poor wise man. Now, as the NIV and most translations have it, he was able to deliver the city through his wisdom. Even though he was a poor man, didn't have great wealth, he was able to deliver the city. Now, there is an alternative translation that you might have depending on what you're using. The Net Bible has that he could have delivered the city. The idea being he could have delivered the city if they had but listened to him. Again, the difference is a bit technical in Hebrew. It depends whether the phrase he delivered is a past definite action or a past potential action. Whether it's he delivered or he could have delivered. The indicative or the modal sense, if any of that makes any sense to you. I don't understand all that. I read it and I can sort of, once I read it, understand it. But I'm thinking that this poor but wise man did have the wisdom to deliver the city. I think that's the way we should take it. Most translations go with that. I think that makes the most sense here. The sad part of the story, though, is that no one remembered the poor man. After he delivered the city, that was it. As we often say, his 15 seconds of fame, 15 minutes of fame were gone. That was it. That's all he got. And they forgot that here was a wise man that could have done a lot more for them. Derek Kidner wrote that if we are to identify with anybody in this little story, it's with the poor wise man. Not as though we should fancy ourselves as universal consultants, simply that, sadly enough, we should learn not to count on anything as fleeting as public gratitude. And I think that is a good application of this, because how often do people do things, and sometimes, sadly, you see people doing things just for the applause, just for the gratitude they get at the end of it, not because it's something that's good that needs to be done. G.S. Hendry commented that what counts in the world's judgment is wealth and self-advertisement. Genuine, unostentatious merit goes unrecognized, unrewarded. This Ecclesiastes describes, ironically, as the wisdom which he saw under the sun, and it seemed great to him. But we still have that in the world today, don't we? How often do people turn to, of all things, film stars to get a comment on something technical? As if they know anything about it. They're film stars after all. But suddenly, because they're rich and famous, we turn to them for advice. Does that really make any sense? I think Hendry got it right there. That's the wisdom of the world, and it's great. It's out there, and a lot of times people don't understand what they're talking about. I'm very much in this crisis that we've been through. As I listen to the First Minister of Scotland, especially, she'll be asked some technical question, and she'll quickly reply, "I don't have that technical expertise, but I'll pass it to one of my colleagues who does." It's when we start thinking we know it all that there is indeed problems. So Solomon arrives at a conclusion in the text. His conclusion is that wisdom is better than might. Even though the poor man's wisdom after this wasn't listened to, I think he may be saying maybe it should have been. He says the words of the wise, heard in quiet, are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. The idea in all this may be that the man was forgotten and ignored after the event was over, but he should have been listened to because he had a lot more wisdom than a ruler shouting among fools. Knut Heim commented this way. He said, "The aggressive, loudmouthed assertions of leaders will always find a lot of followers among fools. The proverb encourages hearers to resist the temptation and to be wise instead. And that's what we need to be." Someone goes on to say that wisdom is better as well than weapons of war. So it's better than might, it's better than weapons of war, but one sinner can destroy a whole lot of good. I thought Derek Kinner had a good comment on this last section. He says the last two verses give an extra thrust to the parable, showing first how valuable and then how vulnerable is wisdom. We're left with more than a suspicion that in human politics, the last word will regularly go to the loud voice of verse 17 or the cold steel of verse 18. Seldom to truth, seldom to merit. And yet, that's what we should be interested in. Truth. Not who's the loudest, but who's telling the truth. Denny Petrillo commented that Satan uses sinful lives and practices to enhance his evil work, whereas the wisdom can neutralize the weapons of war, showing the superiority of intelligence over brute force. One sinner can undo whatever good might be accomplished. The sinner emerges then as the most powerful of all, with the potential to defeat both weapons and wisdom. Now we need to watch out for that. I think there's some lessons that we can definitely learn from chapter 9. I would suggest that from the early part of the chapter, we can learn that we need not base what we think God thinks about us on what's happening in our lives. Don't base God's love for us on what is happening to us. Did not Job's friends do that? Job, suffering immensely, lost so much. And their conclusion is, well, it's obvious. You've done something terrible. This is God doing all this stuff to you. Of course, they didn't realize what was happening. So I think we see that in here as well. That don't base God's love for us on what happens to us in this life. We don't know what's going to happen in this life. So, and it's going to happen to us all, good or bad. Bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. Second lesson I think we can learn is that we should view life as a gift and time as an opportunity. Because I think we see that coming through, that we need to make the most of our lives. And in connection with that, we should choose to be happy and content. You know, we can choose not to be. We can choose to make life miserable for all around us and for ourselves. Or we can choose to accept the gifts that God has given us and enjoy the life that God has given us. And I think, again, along those same lines, God expects us to, whatever we find to do it with all our might. Be hard workers, using our time and our abilities for good. I think we can see the need to learn by observing, by listening. I think we see that coming through, especially in this last section. The poor man who had the wisdom. And maybe another lesson connected with that, we can learn from anyone. But maybe the question is, are we willing to listen? Are we listening to those who we think might be below us, even though they may have the right information? Ecclesiastes, Solomon continues searching for a meaning in life. So far, he's not arrived at much, although we've seen hints and seen glimpses of a pointing towards God. And as we get through the last three chapters especially, things are going to take a more positive turn. It's been very negative, been very depressing in the first 9 chapters. It's going to take a decidedly more positive turn. And then get chapters 11 and 12, a decidedly good turn as he arrives at his conclusions. We hope you'll tune in and pick up our next lesson as well.